All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for watching our third webinar in this series for Granite School District through the UTech Lab at the University of Utah. We do this monthly, so I hope you have a good experience watching this and tune in again next month. For those of you who are attending the live recording, feel free to jump in and ask questions or make comments at any time. We also have a chat option, and there will be a short discussion at the end. I'm just going to give you an introduction to who I am. My name is Ashley Coombs. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from Utah Valley University, and I'm currently a school psychology graduate student at the University of Utah. So today, we are going to be talking a little bit about multicultural competence in the classroom. And this is a topic that I am particularly passionate about as a Latina student, and as our classrooms are getting increasingly diverse. So it's important that we can make sure that we are continuing to serve all of our student populations and address the unique challenges that minority students face. So let's start off by talking about some different terms that are pretty important when discussing something like cultural competence. All right, first up is diversity. Diversity is a term that we hear all the time, but what are those things that really make up diversity? It includes things like race, gender, ethnicity, religion, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, ability and disability, immigration status, and age. Basically, it's all of those things that make up our identity. So what's then the difference between diversity and culture? Culture is all of those things that make groups different from each other. So this can include things like language, food, traditions, clothing, worldview, values, beliefs, holidays. Yeah, it's just those things that make the groups unique and different from each other. And this is particularly important when considering something like race. There's been a lot of discourse recently about using the term African American or Black when referring to our students. Some people argue that there isn't really a difference. Some people argue that you can use them interchangeably. Other people have been pointing out that the culture for students who immigrate from Africa versus our Black students in America have very different cultures. And so, understanding how those things differentiate those groups is really important when we're discussing this sort of a topic. So just for reference, I'll be using the terms interchangeably throughout this presentation. All right, our next term is intersectionality. Intersectionality is the overlap of identities. So for example, we have Rafael, whose parents are undocumented immigrants from Mexico who don't speak English. So, and then Rafael also belongs to the LGBTQ community. Another student, Tahira, is an African-American Muslim student who has spina bifida. So each of these identities combine and they influence the way that our students see and interact with the world. Our next term is privilege. Privilege is a pretty hot button topic, and a lot of people tend to disregard this concept because they think that it means that you're not allowed to have problems if you're part of the majority group, and that's just not true. Everybody has individual struggles. What privilege actually means is that you're not systematically oppressed for your identity. There are not whole systems in place that disadvantage your group. There's an author, Maisha Johnson, who describes privilege as the circumstances in your life that give you benefits that you never asked for. And this goes hand in hand with intersectionality. I'm a Latina student, like I already said, which means that I face some pretty unique challenges as a minority. However, I'm also able-bodied, which means that I don't have any disabilities. So this means that I also benefit from privilege. I don't have to worry about finding housing that accommodates my needs. I don't have to worry about being discriminated against by a landlord. I don't have to think about whether a space is hard to maneuver. I don't have to worry about sensory overload or things like that. There are things that disabled members of our community have to be concerned about on a daily basis that just don't interfere with my life, and that's privilege. It doesn't mean that I'm a bad person, and it doesn't mean that I can't have struggles or that my life isn't hard. It just means that the system as a whole isn't working against me. And it's my job or my responsibility to make space and speak up for people who the system is working against. So, like I said, those two things can exist simultaneously. My status as a minority student and my privilege as an able-bodied member of the community. They don't cancel each other out. It's not a competition. Each one of our identities is important, and it affects the way that we see the world. This also means that we need to be particularly cognizant of the ways our students are disadvantaged, both on an individual basis and as a member of a marginalized group. This again ties back to those identities. Assuming that everyone has the same opportunities is just not realistic. So let's go over our main takeaways about privilege. And I got this from an article by Maisha Johnson. It's called What Privilege Really Means and Doesn't Mean. And basically she just goes through and gives a list of descriptions about what privilege is. And I just took her top 3. She has number 1, having privilege doesn't make you a bad person. It's not an insult. All it means is that you benefit from a system that works in your favor. Number 2, there's a whole system at work. Things like racism and homophobia are supported by the media and by policies, and these are widespread problems, not just an individual one. Number 3, having privilege doesn't mean that you haven't experienced oppression in other ways. Like my example, you can be both disadvantaged and privileged, and those two things don't cancel each other out. So now that we've talked about some pretty important terms, let's dive into some particularly pressing issues in the multicultural classroom. The things we're going to go over today are adjustment to a new cultural environment, low academic achievement, and disproportionate discipline. These are all things that are affecting students in our increasingly diverse classrooms. So the first one is adjusting to a new cultural environment. When students are introduced to a new cultural environment, they might experience something called cultural mismatch. Cultural mismatch occurs when the culture of a child's home is different from what is typically expected in a school setting. So for example, my mom is Mexican. She was raised with 7 siblings in a 3-bedroom house in the San Fernando Valley of California, which is a pretty low income area. And so it's not uncommon for her siblings to be loud and to interrupt each other and to talk over each other to get someone's attention. And that's just not really considered disrespectful or disruptive in her home or in her culture. So imagine the difficulty transitioning to a school environment where that's not considered appropriate behavior, but instead of explaining the difference between school and home, those kids were just expected to know better. A teacher might say, is this how you act at home? And the answer might be yes. Not because they're disciplined at home, but because what is considered appropriate is different. There was a study done on Chinese children in ELL groups, and researchers found that the Chinese students were more reluctant to initiate comments. They avoided criticism. They didn't really want to disagree with their classmates. And, you know, these characteristics could just be personality traits. But, you know, on a widespread level, we're looking at a direct result of their influence, or of the influence of the culture on communication. And so in their culture, directness and frankness aren't considered common ways to communicate. And so students might be uncomfortable with that kind of communication. And these differences can be extremely overwhelming for our students, which might in turn affect their school performance. There is an acronym that stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, and Democratic. It's weird. But according to the American Psychological Association, people from weird societies make up as much as 80% of participants in studies, despite only making up about 12% of the world's population. So this tends to inform our worldview and what we see as normal. And the way these identities overlap also influences culture. So let's talk a little bit more about culture. When I say Western, I'm specifically referring to North American and European culture. So here in the United States, we deeply value individualism, which is independence and autonomy and the freedom to express our opinions and our feelings and our beliefs. And we have kind of an every man for ourselves attitude. We encourage healthy competition. And this is drastically different from collectivistic cultures that value interdependence and maintaining harmony within the group. And like we saw with those ELL students. In Latin and South American cultures, we see a lot of something similar called familialism, where this obligation to your family is centralized and it is your priority above all else. So my mom dropped out of college to take care of her parents without a second thought, because that's just what you do in those cultures. Family is the priority. There are also differences in religion. We see Christianity is really common in Western cultures versus some other religions like Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and others. Some more differences in communication. In Western cultures, we expect direct eye contact. We tend to limit our physical contact, especially with strangers. Whereas in Eastern cultures, it's not uncommon to greet others by hugging, bowing, kissing, and direct eye contact may be considered disrespectful or challenging to authority. We also see differences in family structure. It's not uncommon in Western culture to expect children to live with their parents and siblings. Whereas other cultures, you often see multi-generational homes, so multiple generations all living in one home. So why do we even bother talking about this?